The sun hung low over the endless prairie, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. Red dust swirled in lazy spirals across the main street of Clearwater, a town that squatted like a tired dog at the edge of civilization. Margaret Rose Thompson stood at her bedroom window, watching the distant mountains fade into purple shadows. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men stop mid-sentence and women clutch their husbands' arms a little tighter. Honey-colored hair that caught the light like spun gold, eyes the color of sage after rain, and a grace that seemed out of place in this harsh land. But beauty, she had learned, was just another form of currency in her father's world. "Margaret Rose!" Her mother's voice cut through her reverie like a whip crack. "Come away from that window. Mr. Harrington will be here within the hour." Eleanor Thompson swept into the room, her starched petticoats rustling with disapproval. Despite 20 years in the territories, she clung to Eastern propriety like a drowning woman to driftwood. Her graying hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her mouth had long ago forgotten how to smile without calculation. "Yes, Mother," Margaret murmured, but her fingers lingered on the window pane, leaving ghostly prints on the glass. "And do something about your hair. You look like you've been rolling in the hay with the horses." Eleanor's hands were already reaching for the silver brush on the vanity. "This announcement must be perfect. The Harringtons are offering a partnership that will make your father the wealthiest merchant in 3 counties. Margaret sat obediently at the vanity, watching her mother's reflection in the mirror. "And what am I offering, Mother?" Eleanor's hands stilled for just a moment. "You're offering the Thompson name and companionship to a successful man. Samuel Harrington is 43, established, respected, old enough to be my father." The brush came down harder. "Age brings wisdom and stability. Would you rather marry some young fool with nothing but dreams and empty pockets?" Margaret said nothing, but her mind conjured an image of calloused hands and sun-weathered skin, of men who smelled like leather and honest sweat rather than pomade and cigars. Thomas Thompson's voice boomed from downstairs, followed by the sound of boots and masculine laughter. Margaret's stomach clenched. They were here. The parlor had been transformed into a stage for this particular drama. The good china gleamed on the sideboard, and her mother had even convinced someone to haul in the upright piano from the church. Samuel Harrington dominated the room like a storm cloud, tall, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of flint. His black suit was perfectly tailored, his boots polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him spoke of money and power and the absolute certainty that the world would bend to his will. "Ah, here's my lovely bride-to-be," he said, rising as Margaret entered. His smile reminded her of a wolf sizing up a lamb. "Mr. Harrington," she acknowledged with a curtsy that would have pleased her mother. "Please, call me Samuel. We'll be family soon enough." His hand engulfed hers, dry and possessive. "Your father and I have just concluded our arrangements. The announcement will be in tomorrow's newspaper, and the wedding will follow in 2 months' time." 2 months. Margaret felt the walls of the parlor pressing in. Through the window, she could see the vast expanse of prairie, wild and free, mocking her with its boundless horizon. "Margaret Rose will make a wonderful wife," her father said, his merchant smile firmly in place. Thomas Thompson had built his fortune by knowing the value of everything and everyone, including his only daughter. "She's been educated, knows her numbers, can help with the business. I'm sure she has many talents," Samuel agreed, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. The rest of the visit blurred together. Talk of business ventures, railroad investments, the new house Samuel was building on the hill overlooking the town. Margaret smiled when expected, nodded when appropriate, and felt her soul shrinking with each passing minute. As the men concluded their business with brandy and cigars, Margaret escaped to the porch. The evening air was cool on her burning cheeks. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, wild and mournful. "Planning your escape?" She whirled to find a man leaning against the porch rail, hat tilted back to reveal a face carved by wind and sun. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of whiskey held up to firelight. His clothes were simple worn denim, leather vest, boots that had seen better days, but he wore them with an easy confidence that made Samuel's expensive suit look like a costume. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Margaret said, lifting her chin. "Jake McCready." He touched the brim of his hat, but didn't remove it. "I ranch about 10 miles north of here. Came into town for supplies. Saw all the fuss." His gaze flicked to the parlor window where Samuel's silhouette loomed large. "Congratulations on your engagement." There was something in the way he said it. Not mocking exactly, but understanding, as if he could see straight through the facade to the frightened girl beneath. "Thank you," she managed. "It's a good match." "Is it?" He studied her face with those amber eyes. "Funny how folks always say that about marriages that make good business sense. Never heard anyone say it about marriages that make good heart sense." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I should go back inside. It's not proper for me to talk to a rancher? No, I suppose it's not." He straightened, and she realized he was taller than she'd thought, lean and strong like a Mustang. But then again, I've never put much stock in what's proper, too busy trying to survive out here to worry about what folks think. Their eyes met and held. In that moment, something electric passed between them. A recognition, a possibility, a door cracking open to reveal light. "Margaret Rose!" Her mother's voice shattered the moment. "What are you doing out here?" Jake tipped his hat again, a ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "Ma'am, just passing by. I'll be on my way." He walked away with the loose-limbed gait of a man comfortable in his own skin, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Margaret watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild bird against cage bars. "Who was that?" Eleanor demanded, pulling Margaret back inside. "Jake McCready. He owns a ranch north of town." Her mother's face pinched with disapproval. "A nobody, then." "Come, Samuel is ready to leave, and you must bid him good night properly." As Margaret returned to the suffocating parlor, as Samuel kissed her hand with the lips that felt like dried leather, as her future closed around her like a fist, she couldn't stop thinking about amber eyes and the way Jake McCready had said the word survive, like it was something more than just drawing breath, like it was an act of defiance against a world that wanted to break you. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind howl across the prairie, and for the first time in her life, Margaret Rose Thompson understood that there were different kinds of cages. Some were made of iron bars, and some were made of expectations, respectability, and the cold calculation of profit. And somewhere out there, under the same wild stars, a rancher named Jake McCready was probably sleeping under the open sky, as free as the wind itself. The thought made her heart ache with a longing so fierce it took her breath away. The announcement in the Clearwater Gazette made it official. "Mr. Thomas Thompson is pleased to announce the engagement of his daughter, Miss Margaret Rose Thompson, to Mr. Samuel Harrington of Harrington Enterprises." The words stared up at her from the breakfast table like a judge's verdict, black ink on white paper, sealing her fate. "Isn't it wonderful?" Eleanor beamed, passing the newspaper to yet another visitor. "The wedding will be the social event of the season." Margaret endured another round of congratulations from Mrs. Weatherby and her daughters, their envious eyes taking in every detail of her mourning. Yes, mourning, for what else could she call this heavy feeling in her chest? Such a fortunate girl. Mrs. Weatherby simpered. "Mr. Harrington could have chosen any woman from Denver to San Francisco." "Indeed," Margaret murmured, wondering why that should make her feel grateful rather than trapped. The days blurred together in a parade of wedding preparations. Fabric samples from St. Louis, china patterns from Chicago, endless discussions about flowers and food and the proper way to address the territorial governor's wife. Samuel visited daily, bringing expensive gifts, a pearl necklace, kid gloves, a music box that played a tinny waltz. He would sit too close on the settee, his hand possessing hers, speaking of their future home and the children she would give him. 3 sons, at least, he said one afternoon, his fingers tracing patterns on her wrist. To carry on the Harrington name and business. Margaret felt sick. And if I have daughters? His laugh was dismissive. Then we'll keep trying until we get it right. She began to feel like a prize mare, valued only for her breeding potential. The walls of the house seemed to press closer each day, the air thick with expectations and her mother's constant supervision. Her only escape came in the early mornings, when she would saddle Duchess, her bay mare, and ride out before anyone could object. Her mother disapproved. Of course, ladies didn't gallop across the prairie like wild Indians. But her father, distracted by his ledgers and the promising partnership with Samuel, would wave her off. Let the girl have her rides. He'd say, she'll be settled soon enough. It was on one of these stolen mornings, 2 weeks after the announcement, that Duchess decided to have opinions about crossing a dry creek bed. The mare shied violently at something, a snake, perhaps, or just shadows, and Margaret, lost in thought, wasn't prepared. She felt herself sliding, grabbed for the pommel. But Duchess was already dancing sideways toward the edge of a steep ravine. "Whoa, easy girl, easy!" But panic had seized the mare. She reared, and Margaret knew with terrible certainty that they were both about to tumble into the rocky depths below. Then strong hands seized Duchess's bridle, a calm voice cutting through the chaos. "Steady now, that's it. Nothing here's gonna hurt you." Jake McCready seemed to materialize from the landscape itself, moving with the fluid grace of someone born to this land. He gentled the mare with touches and words, his presence somehow communicating safety to the frightened animal. Within moments, Duchess stood quiet, sides heaving but calm. "You all right? Miss Thompson?" He looked up at her, those amber eyes full of concern. Margaret realized she was shaking. "Yes, thank you. She's not usually so skittish. Creek beds can be tricky. Shadows play different down in the cuts." He released Duchess's bridle slowly, ready to grab it again if needed. "Maybe you should walk her a bit. Let her settle." She dismounted on unsteady legs, and he was there to steady her, his hand warm on her elbow. The touch sent lightning through her sleeve. "Thank you," she said again, stupidly, unable to think of anything else. They walked in silence for a moment, leading Duchess along the ridge. The morning stretched golden around them. Meadowlarks calling from the grass, the mountains standing sentinel in the distance. "You're out early," he observed. "It's the only time I can breathe," she said without thinking, then flushed at the admission. He glanced at her but didn't comment on her words. Instead, he gestured to the land around them. "This is my favorite time, too. World's still soft, you know, before the sun bakes everything hard." They had stopped walking. Margaret found herself really looking at him for the first time, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the capable hands that had gentled her horse, the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and squinting into distant horizons. "Your ranch is near here?" "Just over that rise." "Nothing fancy. Couple hundred head of cattle. A cabin I built myself. Good water from a spring." Pride colored his voice. Not the boastful pride of ownership, but the quiet satisfaction of creation. "I came out here with nothing but a horse and determination 5 years ago. And now I've got something worth keeping." His eyes met hers. Worth fighting for. The intensity in his voice made her look away. "I should go back. They'll be wondering, how's the wedding planning?" The question was casual, but his jaw tightened. Margaret laughed, a bitter sound that surprised them both. "Like planning my own funeral, only I have to smile more." The words hung between them. Too honest, too revealing. She waited for him to offer platitudes about duty and good matches. Instead, he said quietly, "I had a horse once. Beautiful Arabian. Some fellow from back east offered me twice what she was worth. Everyone said I'd be a fool not to sell." He paused, looking out over the prairie. "But every time I thought about her living in some cramped stall, never running free again, couldn't do it. Some things aren't meant to be caged, no matter the price." Margaret's throat tightened. And if the horse had no choice? There's always a choice. Might not be an easy one, might cost everything, but it's there. She thought of Samuel's cold hands, her mother's expectations, her father's business dealings. You don't understand. My family, I understand plenty. His voice roughened. I understand that you ride out here like the devil's chasing you. I understand that you look at that horizon like it's the promised land. And I understand that every time someone mentions your wedding, you flinch like you've been struck. The tears came then, sudden and mortifying. She turned away, but he was already offering his handkerchief clean cotton that smelled of sage and sunshine. I'm sorry, she gasped. I shouldn't. Nothing wrong with tears. Means you're still alive inside. He stood quietly while she composed herself. Not hovering or fussing, just present. Can I show you something? She nodded, not trusting her voice. He led her to a small rise where the land opened up in a spectacular vista rolling grassland that seemed to go on forever, painted in shades of gold and green and purple shadow. This is what I see every morning from my porch, he said simply. This is what freedom looks like to me. Margaret drank in the view, feeling something inside her chest expand. It's beautiful. It's hard, too. Winters that'll freeze your bones, summers that bake the earth to dust, storms that make you question your sanity. But it's real. It's honest. He turned to look at her. That's all a person can ask for, I think. A life that's honest. She met his gaze, and there it was again. That electric connection, that sense of recognition, like looking into a mirror and seeing not her face, but her soul reflected back. I have to go, she whispered. He nodded, helped her mount Duchess with hands that lingered just a moment too long. You know where to find me, if you ever need anything. The ride home was a blur. Margaret's mind churned with impossible thoughts, dangerous dreams. As the Thompson house came into view, she saw Samuel's carriage parked outside, and her heart sank. But something had changed inside her. Jake's words echoed. There's always a choice. For the first time since her engagement was announced, Margaret Rose Thompson began to wonder what she might be willing to sacrifice for freedom. The question terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. As she handed Duchess's reins to the stable boy and walked toward her waiting prison, she carried with her the memory of amber eyes and vast horizons, tucked away like a secret flame that no amount of duty could extinguish. The rumors started as whispers, like tumbleweeds gathering momentum across the dusty streets of Clearwater. Mrs. Weatherby mentioned it first, her eyes bright with the malicious joy of those who feast on others' misfortunes. My nephew saw your Margaret Rose out near Coyote Ridge. She informed Eleanor over tea, in the company of that Macready fellow, quite alone. They were. Eleanor's teacup rattled against its saucer. I'm sure there's an explanation. Perhaps she needed assistance. Oh, I'm certain that's all it was. Mrs. Weatherby agreed, her tone suggesting exactly the opposite. By evening, Samuel Harrington knew. He arrived at the Thompson house as the sun bled red across the sky, his face carved from granite. Thomas Thompson met him in the study, and their voices carried through the walls, not the words, but the tone. Anger, accusation, negotiation. Margaret sat in her room, hands folded in her lap, waiting for the storm to break over her head. When it came, it was her father who delivered it. What were you thinking? Thomas's face was mottled with rage. Meeting with that. That nobody? Do you have any idea what you've put at risk? I wasn't meeting him, Margaret said quietly. Duchess spooked. He helped me, that's all. That's all. Her father's laugh was harsh. Samuel is talking about calling off the engagement. Do you understand what that means? The partnership, the contracts, everything I've worked for. Everything you've worked for, Margaret repeated. What about what I want? The slap came swift and shocking. Margaret's hand flew to her cheek, tears stinging her eyes. Her father had never struck her before. What you want? Thomas's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You want to keep living in this house? Keep eating the food I provide? Keep wearing the clothes I buy, then you'll do as you're told." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. "There's only one solution. Margaret must be kept under proper supervision until the wedding. No more morning rides, no more freedom to wander." "I'm not a criminal," Margaret protested. "No," her mother agreed coldly. "You're a foolish girl who nearly destroyed her family's future for a moment's indiscretion." The new regime began immediately. Margaret's bedroom door now locked from the outside at night. A maid accompanied her everywhere during the day. Her window was nailed shut. "For your own safety," Eleanor claimed. The house became a prettily decorated cell. Samuel visited the next day, his demeanor arctic. "I've decided to forgive this transgression," he announced, as if bestowing a great favor. "But let me be clear. Margaret Rose, once we are married, such behavior will not be tolerated. A wife's duty is obedience, complete and unquestioning." He gripped her chin, forcing her to meet his flint-hard eyes. "That rancher McCready? If I see him near you again, I'll destroy him. I'll burn his ranch, scatter his cattle, and run him out of the territory." "Are we understood?" Margaret nodded mutely, hatred burning in her chest like a coal. "Good. The wedding has been moved up. 3 weeks from today. Your mother agrees it's best not to allow any more opportunities for gossip." 3 weeks. The walls seemed to press closer. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret sat by her nailed-shut window, staring out at the darkness. Somewhere out there, Jake McCready was probably sitting on his porch, looking at the stars, breathing free air. The thought was both comfort and torture. A movement caught her eye. There, barely visible in the moonlight, a figure stood just beyond the property fence. Her heart leaped. Even at this distance, even in darkness, she knew that silhouette. He was too far away to see clearly, but she could imagine him looking up at her lit window, keeping vigil. She pressed her palm against the glass, wishing she could send her thoughts across the distance. "I'm here. I remember. I haven't given up." He stood there for perhaps an hour, never moving closer, never trying to signal, just present. A reminder that somewhere beyond her cage, freedom still existed. When he finally melted back into the shadows, Margaret felt more alone than ever. The next night, he was there again. And the next. Always at the same spot. Always for an hour. Always leaving without attempting contact. It became her lifeline. Those 60 minutes when she wasn't entirely alone. When someone who understood her captivity stood witness to it. Eleanor noticed her daughter's improved spirits with suspicion. "You seem almost cheerful today," she observed over breakfast. "Have you finally accepted your situation?" "Yes, Mother," Margaret lied smoothly. "I understand my duty." But her mind was working, planning. Jake's words echoed. There's always a choice. The wedding was in 18 days. If she was going to choose, it had to be soon. That night, as she waited by the window, she had prepared a message. Using a piece of charcoal from the fireplace, she had written on a white handkerchief, "New moon, Tuesday, midnight, back garden gate." The new moon was 5 days away, the darkest night of the month. When Jake appeared at his usual post, Margaret did something she'd never done before. She lit a candle and held it to the window. Once, twice, 3 times. A signal. He stepped forward slightly, and she saw him more clearly in the moonlight. Even at this distance, she could see his tension, his alertness. She pressed the handkerchief to the window, hoping against hope he could see it, understand it. For a long moment, nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he removed his hat and held it over his heart. Understanding. Agreement. Promise. Margaret blew out the candle, her heart racing. She had crossed a line. There was no going back now. The next days passed in a blur of wedding preparations that felt increasingly surreal. She stood for fittings of a dress she would never wear, discussed flowers for a ceremony that would never happen, smiled and nodded and played the reformed daughter. "I'm so pleased you've come to your senses," Eleanor said, adjusting Margaret's veil. "You'll see, in time, you'll be grateful for this match." Margaret looked at her reflection, a pale ghost draped in white, and thought of a different life, a cabin with a view of endless prairie, calloused hands gentle on her skin, freedom to ride wherever the wind took her, love that was chosen, not contracted. She was promised to another, she whispered to her reflection. "What's that, dear?" Eleanor asked. "Nothing, Mother, just practicing my vows." But in her mind, the sentence completed itself, fierce and defiant. She was promised to another. The rancher took her anyway. Tuesday couldn't come fast enough. Margaret counted the hours, the minutes. Her body went through the motions of daily life, but her soul was already flying across the prairie, already free. On Monday night, as Jake kept his usual vigil, Margaret allowed herself one last signal. She placed her hand flat against the window, fingers spread like a star. Tomorrow. Everything changes tomorrow. He touched the brim of his hat and stepped back into the darkness. Margaret Rose Thompson closed her eyes and began to pray, not for forgiveness, but for courage. In 24 hours, she would either be free or destroyed. There was no middle ground, but as she felt the walls of her prison pressing in, as she thought of Samuel's cold hands and colder heart, as she remembered the vast beauty of the prairie and the warmth in amber eyes, she knew her choice was already made. She was promised to another, but her heart had made its own vow, and tomorrow night, under the dark new moon, she would honor it. The storm rolled in at sunset on Tuesday, as if nature itself conspired with Margaret's plans. Thunder growled across the prairie, and lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, brief revelations. By 11 o'clock, rain lashed against the windows with a violent intensity. Margaret lay fully dressed beneath her covers, heart pounding so hard she feared it might be heard over the storm. She had hidden a small bundle under her bed, a change of clothes, the few coins she'd saved, her mother's silver brush, a sentimental theft she couldn't resist, and the handkerchief Jake had given her that day on the ridge. At 1:45, she slipped from bed and retrieved the keys she'd stolen from the maid's apron that afternoon. Her hands shook as she turned it in the lock. The click seemed loud as a gunshot, but the storm swallowed the sound. The house was dark, everyone driven to early beds by the weather. Margaret moved like a ghost through familiar rooms, each step a small goodbye. At the back door, she paused, looking back at the home she'd known all her life. Then lightning flashed, illuminating her prison in harsh white light, and she turned away without regret. The garden gate stood open. Jake waited just beyond, water streaming from his hat, holding the reins of 2 horses. When he saw her, his face transformed with relief and something deeper, more profound. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said over the storm's roar. "I wasn't sure you would," she admitted, then laughed, wild, free, terrified. "I can't believe I'm doing this." He helped her onto the spare horse, not Duchess, she noted with a pang, but a sturdy mare built for endurance. "We need to move fast. This storm's a blessing. It'll cover our tracks, but it won't last forever." They rode hard through the deluge, Margaret clinging to the saddle as they navigated the darkness. Jake led with the sureness of someone who knew every gulch and rise, even blind. The rain soaked through her cloak within minutes, but she didn't care. Each stride took her farther from captivity. They didn't speak, couldn't, over the storm, but when lightning illuminated their path, she caught glimpses of his face, set with determination and something that might have been joy. Hours passed in a blur of rain and wind and the rhythm of hoofbeats, just as Margaret thought she couldn't hold on any longer. Jake turned into a narrow canyon she would have missed entirely. They followed it deeper, the walls providing shelter from the worst of the wind, until suddenly, a structure loomed out of the darkness, a small cabin with a lean-to stable attached. "Line shack," Jake explained as they dismounted. "Used it during roundups before I built my place. No one knows about it but me and a few old-timers." Inside, the cabin was sparse but dry. Jake lit a lantern, and warm light filled the space. A single room with a fireplace, a narrow bed, a table and 2 chairs. Paradise. Margaret stood dripping in the doorway, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what she'd done. She was alone with a man who wasn't her husband, wasn't even her fiancé. She'd thrown away her reputation, her family, everything. "You're shaking," Jake said softly. "Cold or scared?" "Both. Neither." She met his eyes. "I'm free." His smile was like sunrise. "Yes, you are." He built a fire while she changed into dry clothes behind a blanket he'd strung across a corner. When she emerged, he'd laid out simple food: bread, dried meat, apples. Not fancy. He apologized. "It's perfect." And it was. She was hungrier than she'd been in weeks. They sat at the small table, the fire crackling, rain drumming on the roof. Now that they were here, really here, a new awkwardness settled between them. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. Jake leaned back, studying her face in the firelight. "Now we wait for dawn, then ride for my ranch, pack what we need and keep going. North, maybe, or west to California. Somewhere they won't find us easily. They'll come after us. Yes, Samuel won't let this stand. He'll hire men." "I know." Jake reached across the table, covered her hand with his. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. This isn't going to be easy. We'll be running, at least for a while. Living rough, no fancy dresses or tea parties or any of the things you're used to." She turned her hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. "I was dying in that life. Slowly, properly, but dying all the same. And now I'm alive. Frightened, uncertain, probably foolish, but alive." He brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles with infinite gentleness. "I've been half in love with you since that first night on the porch. Tried to talk myself out of it. You were promised to another, above my station, impossible in every way. And yet, here we are. Here we are." He agreed. She was promised to another. The rancher took her anyway. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. "Though I should say, you took yourself. I just provided the horses." Margaret laughed, surprising them both. "My mother would die of shame." "Do you regret?" "No." The word came fierce and immediate. "Whatever happens, no." Thunder crashed overhead, making them both jump. Then Jake was standing, drawing her up with him. They stood close in the flickering firelight, and Margaret felt as though she stood at the edge of another precipice. Another choice. "I should take the floor," he said quietly. "You need rest, and I want to do this right. You've trusted me this far." She studied his face, the strong jaw, the kind eyes, the weather-carved lines that spoke of honesty and hard work and dreams pursued against all odds. This man who'd waited in the darkness night after night, who'd risked everything for a chance at love. "Jake," she whispered, and rose on her toes to kiss him. It was nothing like Samuel's possessive claims. This was question and answer, promise and fulfillment, gentle and fierce all at once. When they parted, both breathing hard, she saw wonder in his eyes that surely matched her own. "Margaret, I know," she said. "I know." They held each other as the storm raged outside. Two souls who'd found harbor in the tempest. Eventually, exhaustion won. Jake insisted she take the bed, and despite her protests, he made a pallet by the fire. "We have a lifetime for everything else," he said. "Tonight, just rest, knowing you're safe." Margaret lay in the narrow bed, listening to the rain and Jake's breathing. She thought of her parents waking to find her gone, of Samuel's rage, of the scandal that would rock Clearwater. She thought of the uncertain road ahead, the dangers they'd face, the life she'd chosen, rough and wild and free. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, she dreamed not of cages but of endless prairies beneath infinite skies. And when dawn broke clear and bright after the storm, she woke to find Jake watching her with such tenderness it took her breath away. "Ready?" he asked. "Margaret Rose Thompson?" No, that girl was gone. The woman who rose from that bed was someone new, someone brave, someone who chose love over comfort and freedom over security. "Ready?" she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They saddled the horses as the sun painted the canyon walls gold. Somewhere behind them, Clearwater was waking to scandal. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and quite possibly disaster. But as Margaret swung into the saddle and followed Jake out of the canyon into the new-washed morning, she felt nothing but fierce joy. She was promised to another, but she'd claimed herself instead, and whatever price that freedom demanded, she would pay it gladly. The wild prairie stretched before them, endless and welcoming. Margaret laughed aloud, spurring her horse forward, racing Jake toward the horizon. Behind them, the life she'd escaped grew smaller with each stride. Ahead waited everything she'd dreamed of and more. She was finally, truly, completely free. They reached Jake's ranch by mid-morning, but didn't linger. While Margaret watered the horses, Jake moved with practiced efficiency, packing saddlebags with provisions, flour, salt pork, coffee, ammunition. He retrieved a hidden cache of money from beneath a floorboard, and Margaret saw it wasn't much, but it was honestly earned. "Take what you need from the house," he told her. "Blankets, any clothes that might fit. We travel light, but winter's coming." She found herself in his simple home, touching things that spoke of his solitary life. A Bible with pressed wildflowers between its pages, a daguerreotype of an older couple who must have been his parents, shirts mended with careful stitches. She took 2 blankets, a coat that would swim on her but would keep her warm, and impulsively, his mother's photograph. "Ready to say goodbye?" he asked when she emerged. She looked at the neat cabin, the corral he'd built with his own hands, the view he'd shown her that first morning. "This is what you're giving up for me." "No," he corrected gently. "This is what I'm trading for something better. Places can be rebuilt. Love like this, that's once in a lifetime." They rode northwest, avoiding the main trails. Jake knew the land like the lines of his own hands, every water source, every sheltered valley, every hidden path. They pushed hard that first day, needing distance between them and pursuit. By nightfall, they'd reached the Badlands where the earth turned red and strange formations of rock jutted skyward like ancient monuments. Jake led them to a protected overhang where they could camp without being seen from below, as Margaret tended the small fire he deemed safe enough to risk. Jake stood watch, scanning their back trail. The sun died spectacularly, painting the rocks in shades of blood and flame. "See anything?" she asked. "Not yet, but they're coming. Samuel won't let this stand." He turned to her. "Are you sorry? For causing you trouble? Yes. For leaving? Never." They ate simply, biscuits and dried beef, and talked quietly as darkness fell. Jake told her about losing his parents to fever, about coming west with nothing, about the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. Margaret spoke of the suffocating expectations, the loneliness of being seen as currency rather than a person, the slow death of her spirit until that night on the porch. "What made you wait outside my window all those nights?" she asked. Jake poked at the fire, considering. "Couldn't help myself. Knew it was foolish, dangerous even. But the thought of you trapped in there, I needed you to know someone saw you. The real you." They spread their bedrolls near the dying fire. This time, without discussion, they laid them side by side. When Margaret shivered in the cold desert night, Jake opened his arms, and she nestled against him, feeling safer than she'd ever felt behind locked doors. "Tell me about California," she murmured against his chest. "Green valleys and gold hills, ocean that goes on forever, place where folks can start fresh, be whoever they want to be." His arms tightened around her. "Place where no one cares if Margaret Thompson ran off with a rancher." "Margaret McCready," she corrected softly, and felt him still beneath her. "That what you want? More than anything?" They sealed the promise with a kiss under the vast tapestry of stars. The next days blurred together in a symphony of survival. They rode from dawn to dusk, camping in hidden places, always watching their back trail. Jake taught her to read sign-broken twigs, disturbed earth, the language of pursuit. Margaret learned to move quietly, to conserve water, to trust her horse and her instincts. On the fourth day, they saw the dust cloud. "How many?" Margaret asked, shading her eyes. "5, maybe 6 riders, moving fast." Jake's face was grim. "We need to reach Devil's Canyon before they close the distance." They rode hard through the heat, horses lathered with sweat. The canyon Jake sought was a maze of twisted rock, narrow passages, and dead ends, easy to get lost in if you didn't know the way. "Stay close," he warned as they entered. "One wrong turn and we'll be trapped." The canyon walls rose around them. Red rock shot through with veins of white. Their horses' hooves echoed off the stone, and Margaret felt like they were descending into the earth itself. Jake led them through a bewildering series of turns, sometimes doubling back, sometimes squeezing through passages so narrow their legs brushed the walls. Then, shouts behind them. The pursuers had entered the canyon. "Faster," Jake urged, but carefully. A lame horse here would mean the end. They burst from the canyon's far end as the sun touched the horizon. Ahead stretched a vast salt flat, shimmering with heat mirages. Jake didn't hesitate, spurring his horse onto the cracked white surface. "It's 30 miles across," he called back. "They won't follow at night. Too dangerous." Margaret had never experienced anything like it. The salt flat was an alien landscape, white as bone under the rising moon. Their horses' hooves left prints in the crystallized surface, and the silence was absolute except for their breathing and the creak of saddle leather. Hours passed in that strange moonscape. Margaret dozed in the saddle, trusting Jake to guide them. When she woke, the eastern sky was lightening, and mountains loomed ahead. "Almost there," Jake said, and she heard exhaustion in his voice for the first time. They climbed into the mountains as the sun rose, following a game trail through pine and aspen. Finally, Jake turned off into a grove where a spring bubbled from the rocks. "We rest here," he said, practically falling from his saddle. "Horses need water and so do we." Margaret tended the horses while Jake collapsed against a tree. When she brought him water, she saw the toll the last days had taken, the lines of fatigue, the constant vigilance wearing at him. "How much further to safety?" she asked. "No such thing as safety. Not yet, but there's a trading post 2 days north. Friend of mine runs it. He'll help us. Maybe know if there's pursuit still coming." She sat beside him, took his hand. "I'm learning to shoot. You've been protecting us both, but I need to help." His smile was tired but proud. "You've been helping all along. Couldn't have made it this far with someone who complained or fell apart." "I'm tougher than I look." "Yes," he agreed. "You are." They slept a few hours in turns, then moved on. That night, camped high in the mountains, they saw lights far below, campfires, spread out in a search pattern. "They're persistent," Jake observed. "Samuel doesn't like losing his possessions." Margaret's voice turned bitter. "You were never his." "No," she agreed. "I wasn't." The next morning brought new challenges. A sandstorm rose from the desert below, a brown wall that swallowed the world. They tied themselves to their horses, covered their faces, and pushed blind through the howling grit. When it finally passed, they were coated in dust, eyes red and stinging. But they'd gained precious miles. At last, as the sun set on their 7th day of flight, they saw the trading post, a collection of log buildings huddled around a well. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Margaret nearly wept at the sight of civilization, rough as it was. "Let me go in first," Jake said. "Make sure it's safe." But as they approached, a familiar figure emerged from the main building. A grizzled man with a beard like a bird's nest and kind eyes that lit up with recognition. "Jake McCready, you son of a gun!" The man boomed. "Heard you might be heading this way. Word travels fast. Ezra. Faster when there's a posse asking questions and waving money around." Ezra's eyes found Margaret. "This the lady causing all the fuss?" "Margaret," Jake said simply. "My wife." The lie came so naturally, protective and claiming at once. Ezra studied them both, then nodded. "Well then, Mrs. McCready, welcome. Come in, both of you." Got hot food and soft beds, and we'll figure out how to handle those fellows looking for you." As they dismounted on shaking legs, Margaret caught Jake's arm. "Your wife? If you'll have me," he said quietly. "I know it's not official yet, but—" She silenced him with a kiss, there in the dusty yard with their uncertain future still chasing them. "I've been yours since that first night. The rest is just paperwork." They followed Ezra inside, and for the first time in a week, Margaret felt something like hope. They weren't safe yet, might not be for a long time, but they were together. They'd survived the desert, the pursuit, the judgment of a world that said their love was wrong. She was promised to another, but she'd chosen her own path instead. And every blister, every moment of fear, every mile of that unforgiving landscape was worth it for the freedom to choose love. The news Ezra brought turned their blood cold. Samuel Harrington hadn't just hired a few trackers. He'd employed the Morrison gang, 5 men known for bringing back their quarry dead or alive, with a preference for dead. "They came through yesterday," Ezra said, pouring coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. "Asked about you two. I told them I'd seen nothing, but they'll be back. Samuel's offering $500 for your return. Margaret says you stole valuable jewelry from his safe." "That's a lie?" Margaret exclaimed. "Course it is," Ezra agreed. "But it gives them legal cover for whatever they do." Jake's face was stone. "How far behind?" "Day, maybe less. They split up to cover more ground, but they'll regroup here." Ezra leaned forward. "There's more. They hit your place. Jake burned it to the ground. Nothing left but ashes and the stone chimney." Margaret gasped, reaching for Jake's hand. She felt him trembling with controlled rage. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This is my fault." "No." Jake's voice was quiet but firm. "This is Samuel Harrington's doing, not yours." He looked at Ezra. "We need fresh horses, supplies for a hard push to California." "Already saddled and ready," Ezra said. "But Jake, there's another way. My cousin runs a freight wagon to Fort Bridger. You could hide in the wagon, be there in 3 days. From there, catch the California Trail with a wagon train. Safer than riding alone." Jake shook his head. "Too slow, and we'd be trapped if they searched the wagon." They were interrupted by hoofbeats outside. Jake's hand went to his gun, but Ezra held up a calming hand. "That'll be Tom Brennan. He's a friend." The man who entered was young, perhaps 25, with the easy smile of someone who'd never met real trouble. His deputy's badge caught the lamplight. "Ezra, Jake." He nodded, then removed his hat for Margaret. "Ma'am, I'm here unofficial-like, but thought you should know. There's talk in town about what really happened. Folks are saying Samuel Harrington's been telling different stories about why Miss Thompson left. First she was kidnapped, then she stole from him. Now he's claiming, well, claims that don't match up." "What are you saying, Tom?" Jake asked. "I'm saying decent folks are starting to wonder about a man who'd burned down another man's home over a woman who chose to leave. That's not justice. That's vengeance." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Can't do much official. Harrington's got the mayor in his pocket, but if you were to defend yourselves against those Morrison boys, well, sometimes deputies are real slow responding to gunfire." After Tom left, they prepared quickly. Margaret had learned to move with efficiency, packing their saddlebags, checking weapons she was only beginning to understand how to use. Jake showed her how to load his spare revolver. "If something happens to me, nothing will happen to you," she said fiercely. "Listen." He gripped her shoulders gently. "If something happens, you ride hard for Fort Bridger. Ezra's cousin is named William Fletcher. Tell him I sent you. He'll get you to California. I won't leave you. You will if I tell you to." His eyes were intense. "Promise me, Margaret, I won't have your death on my conscience." She promised, hating every word. They left the trading post at midnight, taking a treacherous mountain path Ezra swore only locals knew. The moon was full, turning the trail into a ribbon of silver and shadow. Margaret had thought herself a decent rider before, but this tested every skill she'd learned. One misstep would send them plummeting into the void. Dawn found them high in the peaks, looking down at the valley they'd left behind. Smoke rose from several points, campfires of their pursuers. "They're spreading out," Jake observed, "trying to cut off our routes." They pushed on through the day, stopping only to rest the horses. The trail wound higher, air thin and cold despite the season. Margaret's lips cracked. Her hands went numb, but she didn't complain. This was the price of freedom. Late afternoon brought disaster. They were crossing a steep slope of loose shale when Margaret's horse stumbled. The animal went down, screaming. Its leg twisted at an impossible angle. Margaret barely managed to jump clear as the horse rolled, thrashing in agony. "Easy, girl, easy," Jake soothed, but they both knew. He looked at Margaret, apology in his eyes, then drew his gun. The shot echoed off the peaks like thunder. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered to the brave horse who'd carried her so far. "We'll ride double," Jake said. "It'll slow us down, but—" That's when they saw him, a lone rider on the trail below, looking up at the sound of the gunshot. Even at distance, they recognized the black duster of the Morrison gang. "Run or fight?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Jake studied the terrain. "He'll signal the others. If we run, they'll converge on us. But if we make our stand here—" The rider was already turning his horse, reaching for something, a mirror to signal with. Margaret realized. "Give me the rifle," she said. "Margaret, I've been practicing. I can at least make him think twice about signaling." Jake handed her the Winchester. Margaret braced it against a rock, sighted carefully the way he'd taught her. The rider was still fumbling with the mirror. She squeezed the trigger. The shot struck rock near the rider's horse, sending up a spray of chips. The animal reared, and the mirror went flying, shattering on the rocks. The rider fought for control, finally wheeling his mount back down the trail and out of sight. "That'll bring them all," Jake said, but there was pride in his voice. "Nice shot. I was aiming for his hat." Margaret admitted. They couldn't run, not riding double on these treacherous trails. Jake quickly surveyed their position and began pulling rocks into a rough fortification. "Natural bottleneck here?" he explained. "They'll have to come up that trail single file. We can hold them off. For a while." Margaret helped him prepare their defense, her hands steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. They had perhaps 20 minutes before the gang arrived. 20 minutes to prepare for a fight they probably couldn't win. "Margaret," Jake said suddenly, "there's something I need to tell you, in case—" "No." She pressed her fingers to his lips. "Tell me after. Tell me in California when we're sitting on our own porch watching the sunset." He kissed her fingers, then her lips, fierce and desperate. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known. I'm terrified," she admitted. "So am I, but we're terrified together." The first rider appeared as the sun touched the western peaks, then another, and another. 5 men, spread out just beyond rifle range, patient as wolves. "Jake McCready!" The voice echoed off the rocks. "Send out the woman and you can go free. We've got no quarrel with you. Like you had no quarrel when you burned my home." Jake called back. "That was business. This doesn't have to be—" Margaret grabbed the rifle. "The only way I leave here is with Jake." Harsh laughter from below. "Suit yourself. Missy, just means we collect the bonus for bringing you back damaged." The attack came at dusk. 2 men worked their way up the sides while 3 provided covering fire. Jake and Margaret had good positions, but limited ammunition. Every shot had to count. The battle was fierce but brief. Margaret winced at the whine of bullets off rock, forced herself to aim and fire when Jake called targets. She saw one attacker fall back, clutching his shoulder. Another cried out as Jake's shot found its mark. Then, silence. The survivors had pulled back, but they hadn't gone far. "They'll wait for full dark," Jake said. "Come at us from all sides." Margaret checked their ammunition. 12 rounds left. Not enough. They both knew it. "There's another trail," Jake said suddenly. "More a goat path. Really, leads higher into the peaks. On foot, in the dark, It's suicide, but so is staying here. Margaret looked at the treacherous slope above them, then at the patient killers below. I'd rather die trying to live than waiting to die. They slipped away as the last light faded, leaving their meager fort empty. The trail Jake had remembered was barely a suggestion in the rock, handholds and ledges that required feeling their way in near total darkness. Margaret's skirts caught and tore. Her hands bled from sharp rock. Below, they heard shouts as the gang discovered their escape. "Up here, you fools!" someone yelled. "They're climbing!" Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes lighting the night. Rock chips stung Margaret's face. Jake grunted, and she saw dark wetness on his shirt. "You're hit!" "Keep climbing. Almost there." They reached a ledge just as boots scrambled on the rock below. Jake turned, firing down at their pursuers. Someone screamed and fell. "That's 4 of 5, he gasped. But his ammunition was gone, and the last man was still coming. Margaret could hear him climbing, cursing, promising creative deaths for them both. Then, hoofbeats, dozens of them, thundering up the valley. Torches appeared, streaming like a river of fire along the main trail. "What in the hell?" their pursuer muttered. Tom Brennan's voice rang out. "Morrison, boys. This is a duly appointed posse. You're wanted for arson, attempted murder, and disturbing the peace. Throw down your weapons." The gunfire that followed was brief. When it ended, Tom called up. "Jake, Miss Thompson, you folks all right up there?" "Define all right." Jake called back weakly. It took ropes and strong men to get them down. Jake had taken a bullet through his side, painful but not fatal if kept clean. Margaret refused to leave him, holding his hand as they bandaged the wound. "How?" she asked Tom. The young deputy grinned. "Funny thing about burning down a man's home. Makes folks remember all the other accidents that happened to people who crossed Samuel Harrington. Judge in the county seat's been wanting to clip his wings for years. When he heard what happened, he authorized a real posse. We've got warrants for Harrington and anyone working for him." "So we can go home?" Margaret asked, then realized she had no home to return to. "You can go wherever you want," Tom said, "though I'd suggest somewhere far from here until the trials are done. California sounds nice this time of year." As dawn broke over the mountains, Margaret sat beside Jake's travois, watching the sun paint the peaks gold. They were battered, exhausted, everything they owned lost or left behind. Jake's ranch was ashes. Her family had disowned her. By any measure, they had nothing. "Regrets?" Jake asked, reading her thoughts. She looked at him, bloody, hurt, but alive in hers, then at the vast sky stretching endlessly above them. "Never," she said, and meant it. "We're free." The posse escorted them to Fort Bridger, where Jake could heal properly before the final push to California. And if the good women of the fort whispered about the impropriety of Miss Thompson nursing Mr. McCready so devotedly, well, Margaret had learned not to care what proper people thought. She'd been promised to another, but she'd written her own story instead. And this was just the beginning. The journey back to Clearwater took 3 days. Jake, still weak from his wound, rode in a wagon while Margaret stayed close beside him. The posse had grown during their absence. Decent folks from neighboring towns who'd heard the story and came to see justice done. Their presence felt like a shield. But Margaret knew the real test awaited them in Clearwater. Word of their return preceded them. As they entered the town limits, people lined the streets, some curious, some hostile, others wearing expressions of cautious support. Margaret held her head high, meeting every gaze directly. She had nothing to be ashamed of. They stopped first at Doc Morrison's house, the old physician, no relation to the gang, examined Jake's wound with gentle hands. "You're lucky," he pronounced. "Inch to the left and we'd be having a different conversation. Keep it clean, rest for a week, and you'll be good as new." "We don't have a week," Jake said. "There's a hearing tomorrow. Then you'll attend it sitting down," Doc Morrison said firmly. He turned to Margaret. "I remember delivering you, young lady. Your mother was so proud." His eyes softened. "Still could be, if she'd let herself." The hearing was set for the next morning in the town hall. Tom Brennan had secured rooms for them at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house, the only establishment willing to house them. The widow Calloway, who'd lost her own husband to one of Harrington's business disputes, treated them with quiet kindness. That evening, Margaret stood at the window watching the sun set over the town she'd grown up in. Everything looked the same, yet nothing was. She was different now, marked by desert sun and mountain cold, by fear-faced and overcome. "Nervous?" Jake asked from the bed where Doc Morrison had ordered him to rest. "Yes, but not afraid." She turned to face him. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know these past weeks have been the most real, most alive I've ever felt. Come here," he said softly. She sat carefully on the bed edge, mindful of his bandages. He took her hand, thumb tracing the calluses she'd earned on their flight. Margaret rose. "I've got nothing to offer you now. No ranch, no money, nothing but trouble and an uncertain future. But if you'll have me—" "Yes," she interrupted. "Whatever you're asking, yes." He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his weathered face. "Let me finish, woman. I'm trying to do this proper." He shifted, wincing slightly, and pulled something from his pocket, a simple silver ring. It was my mother's. Been carrying it for years, waiting for you. I guess, Margaret Rose Thompson. Will you marry me, real and legal and in front of whoever's left in this town that'll witness it?" Margaret didn't trust her voice. She nodded, tears streaming, as he slipped the worn ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "Whatever happens at the hearing, we get married tomorrow." They sealed the promise with a kiss that was gentle, mindful of his injuries, but no less binding for its tenderness. The town hall was packed the next morning. Judge William Thornton had arrived from the county seat, a man with a reputation for fairness and an old grudge against those who thought money put them above the law. Margaret recognized faces in the crowd, her parents, her mother refusing to meet her eyes. The Weatherbys, merchants and ranchers and working folks. And there, in the front row like a spider in his web, sat Samuel Harrington. He looked older, Margaret thought. The past weeks had carved lines of rage and frustration into his face. When their eyes met, his were full of cold fury. "This is not a trial," Judge Thornton began, his voice carrying clearly. "This is a hearing to determine if crimes have been committed and if charges should be filed. We'll start with the burning of the McCready Ranch." Tom Brennan testified first, laying out what they'd discovered witnesses who'd seen Harrington's men riding toward Jake's place the night it burned, the threats Harrington had made publicly, the pattern of violence against those who'd opposed him. Then came others. Marcus Fuller, whose farm had suffered a mysterious fire after he'd refused to sell to Harrington. Betty Mason, whose husband had died in an accident after testifying against Harrington in a land dispute. One by one, people who'd been silent for years found their courage. Through it all, Harrington sat stone-faced, his expensive lawyer whispering in his ear. Then it was Margaret's turn. She took the witness chair, very aware of every eye upon her. "Miss Thompson," Judge Thornton began, then paused. "Or do you prefer Mrs. McCready?" "Miss Thompson for now, Your Honor, but that will change by sunset." A murmur ran through the crowd. Her mother made a sound of distress. "Very well. Miss Thompson, tell us in your own words what happened." Margaret spoke clearly. Without embellishment, the forced engagement, the threats, her choice to leave. Harrington's lawyer tried to interrupt several times, but the judge silenced him. "Let me be clear," Margaret finished. "I left of my own free will. I took nothing but the clothes on my back. Jake McCready didn't abduct me. He saved me, and if given the choice again, I would make the same decision." "Even knowing the cost?" the judge asked gently. "Especially knowing the cost. Freedom isn't free, Your Honor, but it's worth any price." The judge nodded. "Mr. Harrington, would you care to respond to these accusations?" Harrington stood slowly, his presence still commanding despite everything. "Your Honor, I've been a pillar of this community for 20 years. I've brought prosperity, progress, civilization to this frontier town. And this is my thanks? Lies and slander from a hysterical woman and a no-account rancher. Are you denying you sent men after Miss Thompson? I sent men to retrieve stolen property and my rightful bride. I was never your property, Margaret exclaimed. You were promised to me. Harrington's composure cracked. Your father and I had an agreement. Contracts were signed. Then this nobody appears and fills your head with foolish notions. He destroyed a profitable partnership, ruined carefully laid plans. He stole what was mine by rights. There's your confession, Your Honor. Tom Brennan said quietly. He just admitted to sending the men. The judge's gavel came down hard. Samuel Harrington, you are hereby charged with conspiracy to commit arson, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of assault. You will be held without bail pending trial. This is outrageous, Harrington roared. You can't. I can, and I have. Deputy Brennan, take him into custody. As Tom and his men moved toward Harrington, the businessman made one last desperate play. Thompson, tell them, your daughter was promised to me. You gave your word. Thomas Thompson stood slowly. The merchant looked older, diminished somehow. He glanced at his daughter, then at Harrington. A contract signed under false pretenses is no contract at all, he said quietly. You told me you'd cherish my daughter. Instead, you tried to own her. Whatever agreement we had died the night you sent killers after her. You'll regret this, Harrington shouted as they dragged him away. All of you. I'll destroy this town. No, Judge Thornton said calmly. You won't. After Harrington was removed, the judge addressed the crowd. Let this be a lesson. No man, regardless of wealth or station, is above the law. Court is adjourned. As people filed out, arguing among themselves about what they'd witnessed, Margaret found herself face to face with her parents. Her father looked uncertain, her mother rigid with disapproval. Margaret, her father began, then stopped, searching for words. I'm getting married this afternoon, Margaret said simply. You're welcome to attend if you wish. To that rancher, Eleanor's voice was icy. After everything we've sacrificed, everything we've built for you, everything you built was for yourselves, Margaret replied, but gently. I found something real, Mother, something true. I'm sorry you can't see that. She turned to go, but her father caught her arm. The ring, he said quietly. The one you're wearing. It's silver. Yes, Harrington would have given you gold, diamonds, and chains to go with them. Margaret met his eyes steadily. I prefer silver and freedom. Something shifted in Thomas Thompson's face. Not quite approval, but perhaps understanding. He released her arm. Be happy. Margaret rose. That's all I really wanted. I just forgot that somewhere along the way. The wedding took place at sunset in the small church at the edge of town. It wasn't the society event Eleanor Thompson had planned. No imported flowers, no governor's wife, no 7-course dinner. Instead, there were wildflowers picked from the prairie, witnessed by Tom Brennan, Doc Morrison, Mrs. Calloway, and a handful of brave souls who'd chosen justice over prosperity. Jake stood carefully, still pale but determined. Margaret wore a simple blue dress borrowed from Mrs. Calloway. When Reverend Phillips asked who gave this woman, a voice from the back said, I do. Thomas Thompson walked forward. Alone. Eleanor had refused to come. He placed Margaret's hand in Jake's, squeezed gently, then stepped back. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. The vows were simple, traditional, but Margaret felt the weight of each word. To have and to hold, for better or worse, for richer or poorer. She'd already lived the worst and poorest parts. Everything from here was better. I now pronounce you man and wife. Reverend Phillips intoned, Mr. Macready, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was sweet, brief, appropriate for public viewing but holding promises of private moments to come. As they turned to face their small congregation as husband and wife, Margaret caught sight of 2 figures at the back of the church. The Morrison gang survivor, shackled between two marshals. Transport to territorial prison. Tom explained quietly. Thought you'd want to know. He testified against Harrington in exchange for a lighter sentence. Harrington's going away for a long time. Outside the church, the stars were just beginning to appear. The same stars that had witnessed their flight, their fear, their fight for freedom. So, Mrs. McCready, Jake said, his arm around her waist. What now? Margaret looked up at those vast skies, then at the man beside her, wounded but not broken, poor in goods but rich in courage. Now we go to California. She said, we build something new, something that's ours. With what? I've got maybe $20 to my name. We've got more than that. We've got strong backs, willing hearts, and a story of survival. That's more than most folks start with. Jake laughed, wincing slightly as it pulled his wound. You sure you won't miss all this? The town, the comforts? Margaret looked back at Clearwater one last time. Somewhere in those neat houses, her mother was probably weeping for the daughter she'd lost to impropriety. Somewhere, Samuel Harrington was raging in a cell, but here, under the endless sky, Margaret McCready was exactly where she belonged. I'm sure, she said. After all, I was promised to another. The rancher took her anyway. Jake finished, grinning. No, Margaret corrected, standing on tiptoe to kiss him again. She took herself. The rancher just came along for the ride. They climbed into the borrowed wagon that would start their journey west, toward new horizons and unknown adventures. Behind them, Clearwater settled into darkness. Ahead, the whole world waited. Margaret had chosen love over comfort, freedom over security, truth over propriety, and as the wagon rolled forward into their uncertain but chosen future, she knew with absolute certainty that she would make the same choice again. She was finally, completely, irrevocably free. The trial of Samuel Harrington became the most attended event in Clearwater's history. The courthouse overflowed with spectators, and those who couldn't get seats stood outside, pressing their faces to windows. Justice, it seemed, was a spectacle everyone wanted to witness. Jake had healed enough to attend, though Margaret insisted he lean on her arm. They sat in the front row, their presence a quiet reminder of what this was truly about. Not just burned buildings and hired guns, but the fundamental question of whether power and money could buy exemption from human decency. The prosecutor, brought in from Denver, laid out a damning case. The testimonies from the hearing were repeated, now under oath. New witnesses emerged, men who'd worked for Harrington and grown sick of his methods, women who'd seen too much and kept silent too long. Mr. Harrington believed he owned this town. The prosecutor concluded. He believed he could own people. When Miss Thompson exercised her fundamental right to choose her own path, he responded not with acceptance, but with violence. This is not the behavior of a civilized man. This is the behavior of a tyrant. Harrington's defense was predictable. He was a businessman protecting his interests. The fire was an accident. The Morrison gang had exceeded their instructions. But his arrogance betrayed him. Under cross-examination, his temper flared. "She was mine," he shouted at one point, pointing at Margaret. "Bought and paid for. Her father gave his word." "People cannot be bought, Mr. Harrington," the judge reminded him coldly. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. As the judge read the sentence, 15 years hard labor, Harrington's composure finally shattered completely. "You'll see," he screamed as they dragged him away. "This town will rot without me. You'll beg for my return." Outside the courthouse, Margaret and Jake found themselves surrounded by well-wishers. Some were the same people who'd whispered about scandal weeks ago. Human nature, Margaret reflected, was nothing if not adaptable. Thomas Thompson approached through the crowd, Eleanor reluctantly in tow. Her mother looked as if she'd aged years in the past weeks, her rigid propriety replaced by something more fragile. "Margaret," Eleanor began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words. That is, What your mother is trying to say," Thomas interjected gently, "is that we were wrong. I let greed cloud my judgment. I nearly sold my daughter's happiness for a business partnership." Eleanor's composure cracked. "When we heard about the gang, about the shooting, I thought we'd lost you forever, and all I could think was that the last words between us were angry ones." Margaret felt Jake's supporting hand on her back as she stepped forward. "We all made choices, Mother, but it's not too late to make better ones." The reconciliation was tentative, fragile as spring ice, but it was a beginning. Eleanor would never fully approve of her daughter's choices, but she could learn to accept them. And acceptance, Margaret had learned, was sometimes the best one could hope for. 2 days later, as Jake and Margaret prepared to leave for California with a wagon train, half the town turned out to see them off. Doc Morrison pressed a medical kit into their hands. Mrs. Calloway had packed enough food for 2 weeks. Even some of Harrington's former associates contributed supplies, perhaps hoping to buy forgiveness for their past blindness. "It's not charity," Tom Brennan explained when Jake tried to refuse. "It's investment. You two proved something important, that one person standing up to power can make a difference. That's worth supporting." The wagon train consisted of 15 families, all seeking new beginnings in California. Jake had traded work. He'd help with the livestock and hunting for their passage. Margaret would help with cooking and tending the sick. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. As the wagons rolled out of Clearwater, Margaret saw her parents standing by their store. Her mother raised a handkerchief, not quite a wave, but an acknowledgement. Margaret touched her fingers to her lips and blew a kiss back. "Regrets?" Jake asked, as he had so many times before. "None," Margaret said, as she always did. But this time, she added, "only gratitude." The journey to California took 4 months. They crossed rivers that tried to sweep away wagons, climbed passes that seemed to scrape the sky, survived storms that tested every ounce of their resolve. Margaret learned to drive oxen, to make bread in a Dutch oven, to read weather signs. Jake's wound healed completely, leaving only a scar to remind them of their trials. They faced hardships, broken axles, scarce water, the constant threat of accident or illness. But they also found community. Around the campfires at night, Margaret discovered that everyone had a story of leaving something behind for the hope of something better. She wasn't unique in her flight from an unwanted future. She was part of a grand tradition of those who chose the unknown over the unbearable. One family, the Kowalskis from Poland, had fled religious persecution. Another, the Changs from China, sought gold and freedom from poverty. The Washingtons, a free black family from Mississippi, wanted land where their children could grow up as full citizens. Each story was different, yet fundamentally the same. People choosing hope over fear, possibility over certainty. "We're all running from something," Mrs. Kowalski observed one evening as the women prepared dinner. "But more important, we're all running to something." Margaret thought of those words often as the weeks passed. She'd run from Samuel Harrington, from a life of proper suffocation. But more importantly, she'd run toward Jake, toward freedom, toward a life of her own making. They reached California in October, as the valleys turned gold with autumn grass. The wagon train dispersed at Sacramento, families scattering to chase their various dreams. Jake had heard of opportunities in the Northern Valley's ranching country where a man could start fresh. They found it in a valley cupped between gentle hills, with a creek running clear and cold down the middle. The land was for sale cheap. The previous owner had given up after a harsh winter. But Jake saw potential, and Margaret trusted his vision. They built their first shelter together, a single room of logs chinked with mud. With a stone fireplace Jake constructed carefully. It wasn't much, certainly nothing like the Thompson house in Clearwater, but it was theirs. Every log placed, every stone fitted, was an act of creation and defiance. Their first winter was hard. Snow came early and stayed late. They survived on preserved food and what Jake could hunt. There were nights when the wind howled so fierce Margaret thought the roof might lift off. Nights when they huddled together for warmth and wondered if they'd been fools to come so far. But spring came, as it always does, and with it, their first crop, their first calves, their first real hope that they could make this work. Jake proved to have a gift for breeding horses, and soon ranchers from neighboring valleys were coming to buy his stock. Margaret started a vegetable garden that flourished in the California soil, selling produce at the nearest town's market. By their second anniversary, they had a real house, 4 rooms and a proper kitchen. By their third, they had hired hands and a reputation for fair dealing. The McCready Ranch became known as a place where honest work earned honest pay, where a man's past mattered less than his present effort. They had children, 3 of them. James, who had his father's steady nature and gift with animals. Sarah, who inherited her mother's spirit and her grandmother Thompson's head for figures. Thomas had written, tentatively at first, then with growing warmth, sharing news of Clearwater's slow recovery from Harrington's influence. And little Margaret, called Maggie, who at age 4 could already ride better than most adults. On their 10th anniversary, Jake surprised Margaret with a trip to San Francisco. As they stood at the ocean's edge, watching the sun sink into the Pacific, Margaret marveled at how far they'd come. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked. "When you were standing outside my window in Clearwater, did you dream we'd make it this far?" Jake pulled her close. "I dreamed of you being free. Everything else, that's been a gift." They received word that Eleanor had died peacefully in her sleep, followed 6 months later by Thomas. The inheritance was modest but meaningful enough to expand the ranch, to build the school Margaret had been advocating for in their growing community. Samuel Harrington died in prison in the 8th year of his sentence, unmourned and largely forgotten. His empire had crumbled without him, divided among creditors and bought up by the very people he'd tried to crush. The Clearwater Gazette ran a brief obituary that focused more on his crimes than his achievements. "Do you forgive him?" Jake asked when they received the news. Margaret considered the question as she watched their children playing in the yard she'd planted, on the land they'd claimed, living the life they'd chosen. "I don't think about him enough to forgive him," she said finally. "He's just irrelevant now." And he was. The man who'd tried to own her had become nothing more than a footnote in her story, while she had become the author of her own tale. Years passed. The McCready Ranch grew into one of the most successful in Northern California. Their children grew up and began stories of their own. James married the daughter of the Kowalski family they'd traveled west with. Sarah scandalized everyone by attending university in San Francisco, becoming one of the first female doctors in the state. Maggie, true to her nature, married a ship's captain and sailed the world. On their 25th anniversary, Jake and Margaret sat on their porch, a grand wraparound porch on a house that had grown with their success. The sun was setting over their valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. "Was it worth it?" Jake asked, his hair silver now but his amber eyes still warm. "Everything we went through." Margaret looked out over their land, the cattle grazing peacefully, the orchards heavy with fruit, the homes of their workers dotting the valley. She thought of the frightened girl in Clearwater who dreamed of freedom without knowing what it would cost or where it would lead. "She was promised to another," Margaret said softly. "The rancher took her anyway." Jake finished, as he always did. "And thank God for that." Margaret laughed, lifting her face for his kiss. As the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their desperate flight so many years ago, Margaret McCready knew with absolute certainty that every choice, every sacrifice, every moment of fear and uncertainty had been worth it. She had chosen love over obligation, freedom over security, the unknown over the unbearable. And in doing so, she had discovered that the greatest adventure wasn't in the running away, but in the building of something new. Their story had begun with a promise she couldn't keep, and a love she couldn't deny. It had led through fire and flight, through trial and triumph. And now, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Margaret understood that the real promise had been kept after all. The promise to live authentically, to choose courageously, to love completely. She was promised to another, But she had claimed herself instead, and that had made all the difference. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining me on this wild journey through the American West. I hope Margaret and Jake's story touched your heart as it did mine. Where are you listening to this tale of love and freedom? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to know if you're enjoying this from a bustling city, or perhaps your own quiet corner of the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories of courage, adventure, and romance from the American frontier. Your thoughts and feelings about Margaret's choice mean the world to me. Did you find yourself rooting for her freedom? Share your reflections below. And let's keep the spirit of the Wild West alive together.